I thank you all for coming. I didn't expect such a great turnout. This is September 17th, the date that our Constitution was signed back in 1787. And within 2 years, we got a new government in 1789 with a new president, a new institution, a new Congress, and our government started operating as we know it today. A lot of people forget that we had a constitution prior to this one, the Articles of Confederation, which proved to be ineffective, to say the least. So we want to remember today the Constitution, the day that it was signed, and talk a little bit about the state of our Constitution today, how it's changed, and what it bodes for the future. And we've got three good panelists here. Professor Robert Hendershot to the far end of the table, teaches history here for us at GRCC. Professor Carolyn Grin, who teaches economics as well as history here at the college, and Professor Heather Forrest, who is now our new full-time political science professor. So we're very glad to have all three. I am Keith St. Clair. I also teach political science here at the college, if you didn't know that already. And again, I thank you for coming. And we're going to turn it over to the panelists real quick. They're going to have a few short words to say about the Constitution. But we definitely want to move from that to your questions and devote most of the time to your questions and answering them over the next hour. So again, thank you for your attendance. And we'll start with Professor Hendershot.
Good afternoon. My name is Bob Hendershot. And I was asked today to sort of focus my remarks on the presidential war powers. And so I thought even within that I'd focus it on this idea of democratizing American war making that we've sort of seen a trend in the 20th century. In a constitutional sense, there is a paradox, right? There is a contention on this issue, right? Because it is our Congress that is empowered to declare war and to set the funding for the Army and the Navy and the other branches of the military. Well, it's the President who's the commander-in-chief. Okay? And so there's a division of powers there, but it's a division of responsibility regarding American war making. And that's been frequent grounds for debate, and it continues to be so. All right? And it's becoming a more and more contentious issue, right? Recently, with the current president, right, the current presidential administration, there's a new theory, right, of executive power called the Unitary executive theory. And this argues that as commander-in-chief, right, the president, right, in fulfilling his duties as commander-in-chief, can't be bound by any law, right, any action of Congress. All right? And you can see how that sets up an interesting question, right? So the central issue is, how do we Americans choose to make war, right? Does our commitment to the concept of the people's will, right, we the people, right, does our commitment to the people's will influence how Americans make war? All right? How do we, as a nation, decide when to use force? How do we choose to direct that force? And then, of course, how do we decide when to stop using that force? Right? And throughout the 20th century, you see this idea, this goal of democratizing American war making emerge several times. Right? A nice aspect of constitutional law is to look at amendments to the Constitution that were proposed but that never left the halls of Congress, amendments that were proposed but never went out for ratification. For example, in 1916, an amendment was proposed that all acts of war should be put to a national vote. And to vote yes was to simultaneously volunteer for service in the U.S. Army. Okay? And of course, it never left Congress. It was never ratified. But it points to an idea about democratizing American war. And that same concept came out in 1933 when, again, a similar amendment was proposed to amend the Constitution that when the Americans went to war, we'd put it to a national vote. All right? And everyone would say yes or no, war or no war. Again, it didn't become law. But still, it's an interesting trend. It's an interesting idea that hasn't yet gone away. After 45, we see the executive branch of government grow in its power during the Cold War. All right? New branches of executive authority, right? Special agencies for central intelligence and national security, a new organization for our Department of Defense. Right? And in the Cold War, we saw Americans continue to make war, but without official declarations. We saw Americans make war in Korea and in Vietnam. And the Constitution, the spirit of it, was still with us, right? The U.S. Congress authorized the use of force in Vietnam in what was called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, right? But the Vietnam War went on, and eventually it became very unpopular, right? So much so that the Congress felt that it should withdraw that permission to make war, to use force in Vietnam, right? The Tonkin Gulf Resolution was repealed, okay? And it didn't have the desired effect because the war carried on. Right. During the Watergate crisis, the presidency was weak, and so the Congress decided to take this to the next step, right? And they passed a landmark measure, right, called the War Powers Act, which was intended to democratize American war-making. Right? It was intended to limit presidential power, right? To make the president, to limit his power to make war without the consent of the people's representatives in Congress. And what the War Powers Act says was that if the president decided to use force, he would have to explain that decision to Congress, right? And if there was a crisis and he had to respond immediately and send in soldiers, then within 48 hours, he'd have to respond and explain that decision to Congress. And most importantly, the War Powers Act says if the United States president sends U.S. soldiers into hostilities overseas, he has to withdraw them within 60 days unless the Congress says he can keep them there longer. Okay? And so this is an interesting piece of legislation that brings control over American war-making into the Congress, to the people's representatives, shorter terms. And of course, President Nixon vetoed the War Powers Act, but they had enough support to override it. Okay? Congress believed that they had found a happy medium, right? That would allow the president to be flexible in the event of a crisis, but also that it would make the president, in his capacity to be the commander-in-chief, it would make him responsible to the people. And since then, we've seen this change American war-making, right? Most recently with the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, right? The presidents have been very careful to make sure that they had popular support and congressional support before that began. All right? But now we face the natural extension of this question, right, of this idea of democratizing American war-making. Okay? How much can the Congress influence the president? Right? The Congress has the ability to declare war. Right? They have the ability to declare when a state of war exists. And the flip side of that, logically, the flip side of that coin is that the Congress then has the ability to state when war does not exist. Right? And this is within the spirit of the Constitution. But can the Congress declare that the war is finished? Right? Can Congress mandate the end of the use of force? According to the Unitary executive theory, right, which is current in terms of debate, right, the current president argues that as the unitary executive, right, the Congress, of course, cannot do that. Right? He cannot bind the president's role as the commander-in-chief in any way whatsoever. So the process of democratizing the use of American force has been a 20th century trend. You can see evidence of it, but it's incomplete. Right? And that's the question that I think you will see being worked out over the course of the next 20 or 30 years, over the course of your careers, right? You know, of all of our lives. All right? Will it continue now? Will the use of American force continue to be democratized? All right? Will we see another leap forward, right, because of the current unpopular war? Okay? Or will the trend stall? Right? And will we see the use of American force become concentrated, right, in the office of the executive? All right? Will power over American force become concentrated in the Oval Office? Or will it continue to be democratized? Right? And will we the people have more influence over when and how and when to stop making war? Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Professor Grin.
Thank you. I'm Carolyn Grin, and as you can tell, there's a somewhat of a theme today to our presentations, which is what does the Constitution tell us about the powers of the President? Every one of us learned in high school civics classes, or hopefully before, that our Constitution set up separate branches of government. The legislature, we call it the Congress, is supposed to pass laws. The executive, the president, is supposed to, execute the laws. Yet this same Constitution gives the president, who is the chief executive, also a very powerful veto power, a legislative veto. In fact, you could argue it makes him the chief legislator. Now, the word veto is actually never even mentioned in the Constitution. After the House and Senate pass a bill, they send it to the president for signature, and he has 10 days to send it back. If he returns the bill and doesn't sign it, that's what's called a veto. Now, there's also something called a pocket veto. If the president receives a bill from Congress and there are less than 10 days left in the congressional session, and this is a big and, if the Congress adjourns within that 10 days, the president can stick the bill in his pocket, hence the term pocket veto, forget about it, and the bill fails to become law. Now, the veto has, over the last 200 years, become an incredibly powerful tool for the president, and one that has grown, especially by leaps in the early 19th century and now more recently. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any electronic records of the debates of the Constitutional Convention. In fact, our founding fathers, and believe me, they were founding fathers, there weren't any mothers at the Constitutional Convention, but our founding fathers intentionally decided not to take any minutes. But there's pretty solid indications that the original intent of the presidential veto was to serve as a check on Congress from Congress passing a law that was in conflict with the Constitution. Now, today we think of the main check on Congress as the Supreme Court, the court's power of judicial review. But remember, the power of judicial review isn't in the Constitution. That's something that the courts invented in Marbury versus Madison. So, anyway, the best evidence, as I said, that the veto was supposed to serve as a check on the legislature doing something unconstitutional is the action of our early presidents. The first 6 presidents, from George Washington through John Quincy Adams, collectively, they only vetoed 9 pieces of legislation. And every time they vetoed something, they accompanied it with a statement about why they thought the bill was unconstitutional and therefore should be vetoed. Then comes the presidency of Andrew Jackson. He used the veto 12 times. So in other words, all 6 presidents before him, collectively 9 vetoes. Then Jackson, 12 times. Jackson was involved in a big fight with the Congress over renewal of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. Now, whenever he used the veto, he justified it not by saying he thought the bill before him was unconstitutional. He said he didn't like the bill. It was bad law. So if you think of it, this was a tremendous expansion of the meaning of the veto power and correspondingly of the legislative power of the president. And given the personalities of the people who seek the presidency, once power expands, it rarely shrinks. Collectively today, counting both these regular vetoes I talked about and the so-called pocket vetoes, all the presidents together have vetoed over 2,500 different pieces of legislation, 2,550 to be exact. Franklin Roosevelt holds the record at 635. Grover Cleveland's a close second at 580 some. And of course, just the threat of a veto is a tremendous power. Now, we have to acknowledge, or I have to acknowledge, that the president's legislative veto isn't absolute. It's not like the veto that, say, the United States has in the Security Council at the United Nations. First of all, Congress can override a veto. But believe me, it isn't easy. I mean, to override a veto requires 2 supermajorities. It's not just 2/3 of congressmen voting against it. You have to have 2/3 vote in the House and a 2/3 vote in the Senate. And to give you an idea how difficult it is to override a veto, and by implication, the power that the veto gives the president in matters of legislation, of those 2,500 plus vetoes that I've just mentioned have collectively been used, they have been overridden only 106 times. That comes out to about 4%. And another problem that limits the power of the president in terms of the use of the veto is that the president has to veto the entire bill. Unlike the power of some state governors, including our own Michigan governor, the president doesn't have what's called a line item veto. He can't just X out the parts he doesn't like. Now, every president since Dwight Eisenhower, including our current president, has called for the line item veto. Particularly in appropriation bills, it is very easy for congressmen to stick in earmarks, or what's sometimes called pork, knowing that it's difficult for a president to veto an entire appropriation bill, and thereby they can get their pet projects passed. In fact, in response to this problem, back in 1996, Congress passed a line-item veto act, which allowed the president to veto individual budgetary expenditures just in regard to appropriation bills. The reasoning went that if Congress has got the power of the purse, they've got the power to delegate some of their authority to someone else, in this instance the president, and that it isn't necessary, as some argued, that you have to amend the Constitution in order to do this. Well, so Congress passed it. Well, needless to say, Clinton, who was president at the time, didn't veto this piece of legislation. Unfortunately, I guess for the president, 2 years later, the Supreme Court, in effect, vetoed it when they declared it unconstitutional. So, at the moment, the president's got the veto, but no line-item veto. Or at least nothing that at the moment we're calling a line-item veto. But what we've seen in recent years is the emergence of a different, a bigger, a larger version of the line-item veto, and that is what is called or referred to as signing statements. Now, there's nothing new about signing statements. You can go all the way back to James Madison. A signing statement is just that. The president issues a signed statement at the time he signs a piece of legislation, explaining his opinions about the legislation. But recently, there has been an incredible shift in the use of signing statements. Primarily, previously, signing statements were either political or rhetorical in nature. Now you've seen the emergence of a new kind of signing statement. In fact, scholars have taken to calling them constitutional signing statements. In effect, what the president is saying is that part of the bill he is signing he considers constitutionally defective. And he's directing government agencies to apply the law according to the president's, interpretation of what he thinks the Constitution means. We first saw the expansion of these constitutional signing statements in a significant way during the administration of George H.W. Bush, Bush #1. And not surprisingly, they grew in frequency during the Clinton years. It's one of those issues, as I said earlier. Once power expands, especially when it's concentrated in one person, it rarely goes back. Now, in the current Bush administration, the use of constitutional signing statements has absolutely exploded. Bush has issued almost 150 constitutional signing statements, challenging about 800 federal laws. Now, are these signing statements legal? The U.S. Constitution doesn't specifically permit or prohibit them. In fact, as a practical matter, you could say that they signal the president's intentions in terms of how he's going to interpret the law. Yet at the same time, last year, a task force that was set up by the American Bar Association issued a huge study that basically concluded that the practice is unconstitutional, is contrary to our Constitution. What critics are saying, in effect, is that President Bush is using signing statements as a line-item veto. By the way, I should say that the current President Bush, his use of the tradition, he's only used the traditional veto 3 times. But as I just mentioned, he's issued basically 150 of these constitutional signing statements. And the Supreme Court has not dealt directly with the legality of these. To the extent that a signing statement nullifies part or all of a piece of legislation, you could argue that the court has indirectly dealt with the legality of these signing statements when they nullified the Line-Item Veto Act in 1998. In fact, last year, in a Supreme Court case, Hamilton versus Rumsfeld, the Supreme Court totally ignored a very, very lengthy signing statement when it interpreted the Employee Treatment Act of 2005. But, in conclusion, until or if the Supreme Court does deal with these signing statements, future presidents, and Democrats as well as Republicans, it's by human nature, they're going to continue to expand the use of the signing statements, and in effect, they're going to be expanding the veto power of the president over the legislative process. So we should pay attention to these. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Forrest.
Okay, well, I don't think I have quite as much to say about executive privilege is the area that I'll be discussing a little bit today. Executive privilege is actually defined as the right of the president and more recently his administration or people within his cabinet to withhold certain information from Congress, even if it is subpoenaed. Generally, in history, executive privilege has been reserved for issues involving national security, but not always. Executive privilege has been used to withhold information that does not involve national security. Executive privilege is actually mentioned nowhere in the Constitution. It's not written in the Constitution, but it is implied from the Constitution. And past presidents have argued that there's a need for it. And in order to do their job, cabinet members and advisors need to know that the advice that they give the president or the information that they use to give the president advice needs to be protected in some way in order to enable them to do their job adequately. Because without executive privilege, they'd be afraid to give the information. Unfortunately, when it comes to executive privilege, much like our early, the evolution of our early government, the Supreme Court has very quickly became the umpire between the president and Congress. When the president would choose not to disclose certain information, the Supreme Court would have to determine whether or not the president or the Congress were in the right and whether or not he should turn over documents. Once again, it's nowhere in the Constitution. It has been invoked by every president since George Washington, obviously. George Washington used it to keep information silent and away from Congress involving the Indian massacre and soldiers because he felt that the situation was too volatile and it would jeopardize peace between the Indians and the soldiers. The House of Representatives also subpoenaed information in regards to the Jay Treaty that long ago. And the president refused to turn over those documents, saying that the House of Representatives has no control over treaties or confirming of treaties because that's solely the Senate. So he refused to give the information to the House, but he turned it over to the Senate. So executive privilege has been used throughout history for several things. Nixon tried to use it to keep his tapes silent, and that didn't work out too well for him. He had to turn over those tapes and subsequently had to resign because he would have been the first president impeached and surely removed. Executive privilege is, once again, just something that the president invokes when he doesn't want to reveal information to Congress. All presidents have used it. Some presidents use it more than others. And some presidents use it for questionable information. And once again, it's generally is left up to the Supreme Court to determine whether or not the president has to disclose the information. So, there you go.
Thank you. Okay, is there any questions from you, the audience, that you might have for our panel on either what was said or something in addition, too? Yes?
All three of you talked about the expanding power of Congress. And I want to know why Congress has not stood up to the president. And I'm not talking about going to court, but either turning off the funds for the war and ending this thing in Iraq, or impeaching the President of the United States. I mean, if they're really concerned, or if we're really concerned about the people having a greater role in the making of policy, isn't our Congress really not doing their job?
Any takers on the
Take a swig
panel?
before you answer that one there, Bob.
To turn off the funds for the war would be one way to achieve the ends that you mentioned, okay? In a strategic sense, they could do that and believe that it would end the war, but not necessarily, okay? To cut off funds for the war would mean cutting off funding for the military, which would leave everyone in Congress open to charges of not supporting the soldiers, okay? Support for the soldiers, support for the war are two different issues, but if you cut off the funding, right, and that could jeopardize people, then that might force the hand. I'll tell you an example of Congress holding the purse strings. When Teddy Roosevelt was president, he wanted to send the Great White Fleet, right, the American Navy, around the world, right, to demonstrate American strength and technology and capability. Okay, and he didn't have the funds to get them all the way around the world, but nevertheless, it was very important that he do it. He had exactly enough money to get them halfway around the world. Okay, and so he sent them out. Okay, and if Congress wanted the American Navy to come home, then they'd have to cough up. And now I think we're in a similar position. All right, there has to be some agreement on strategy and ends and exactly what the end of the war would look like before you can just pull the fund on the money, or it would be a political disaster for the people in Congress who voted for that funding.
If we look at the Constitution, yes, the Congress has tremendous powers, but I think it's different to talk about power that is concentrated in one person versus power that is spread out over 535 people divided between two houses. A president is so much more effective at using it. Now, in response to Congress, in terms of what I was talking about earlier, the constitutional signing statements, I think it would require someone to take one of these, take the issue to court and force the Supreme Court to rule on the issue.
Rule on the issue
Of the constitutionality of these types of signing statements.
Okay. The question was posed, why hasn't Congress done anything? And why hasn't the president been impeached, correct? Or if they're not going to cut off funding, impeach the president. Well, Congress, as much as we may or may not have liked what Congress has done, Congress is a part of the separation of powers. And the action that they take is a direct reflection of what the people who vote want. Now, yes, given the Democrats don't seem to be doing what the Democratic people want them to be doing right now, but they're also even conflicted within the Democratic Party as they are within the Republican Party. So I don't think that there's a universal consensus on what to do about the war in Iraq. You have people that are against it. You have people that are for it. But the country is not in a universal consensus. Even still today, there are people conflicted over whether or not we should remain there until it gets stable. And there are those people who argue that we should just bring our troops home and deal with whatever may come. So we can say Congress isn't doing anything, but Congress is doing something. They're just maybe not doing what you want them to do. And that's not always what we get when we have our Congress. So I guess that would be my response.
How about you, Keith?
Okay. Well, I was going to actually expand the question. I mean, you really kind of address why the Congress hasn't done anything. But assuming that, and I know I don't want to go into a disagreement on the panel on this point, but let's just assume that getting out of the war is the thing to do, and that we're all in agreement on that. The question Calvin asked kind of begs the further question is, how is it appropriate to end this war? Assuming that ending the war in Iraq and bringing the troops home is a goal that everyone can agree on, just making that assumption, what is the appropriate way to end the war?
If I had the answer to that, I would be very rich.
I do not want to see us, as in the end of Vietnam, with people climbing aboard helicopters and leaving behind a tremendous number of people who supported, rightly or wrongly, the American war effort in Vietnam. Think of some of the devastations we caused. I think, even though we didn't plan very well in terms of getting into Iraq, I think we have to plan better about how we exit.
But assuming that the Congress wants to end the war and the President refuses to end the war, what is the appropriate course of action for the Congress?
This would be new territory, right? Can the Congress mandate the end of the use of force in a particular region?
Well, constitutionally, how should it be done? I mean, politically, we've all seen how difficult it is for Congress to just pull the plug on the funding of the troops, and how politically disastrous that would be if it cost American lives, which most would think that it would. So if that's not an answer for Congress, what is the appropriate response? Kelvin mentioned impeachment. Is that the appropriate way to end a war, to impeach the president when he doesn't want to?
It may not be necessary constitutionally. The Constitution says that the Congress is empowered to declare war, and therefore it's implied in the spirit of the Constitution that Congress is empowered to say when a state of war does not exist. And if they were to pass a resolution that there is no more war, that the war must end, that would be left to the courts, right? And the courts could choose to uphold that as a law, right, that the war come to a close.
And the war, would that be a resolution or a law? Or either?
Either. I mean, it could be, a law of Congress.
And if the president didn't comply, then it would be up to the courts to rule on that?
I should think so. That's my understanding. Is that correct?
There has been no declaration of war. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Korea, in Vietnam, there was never a formal congressional declaration of war.
But it is nevertheless warfare, right? If you call the tail on a dog a leg, how many legs does a dog have?
It's a peacekeeping operation.
Heather, how to appropriately end the war? If the president doesn't want to do it and Congress does, what is the options available to Congress?
Well, people keep mentioning impeachment, and I just want to remind everybody, if you impeach the president, we have Dick Cheney, all right? So we're not moving in a different direction. So please keep that in mind about
they could impeach both the president and the vice president, put Nancy Pelosi in there, and pull the plug on this war.
They could, but
would that be appropriate?
Impeachment is
that. Well, that would be an opinion. But if you're talking about an appropriate way to get out of the war, then you have to think about things that Congress can conceivably do. And we've talked repeatedly. You've heard repeatedly in the news. That Congress needs to start putting stipulations on these benchmarks and not have the benchmarks be suggestions, but have them be requirements. And if Iraq doesn't meet those benchmarks, then you need to start pulling out troops in response to that. But the problem with Congress has been the president will veto any legislation with benchmarks or any kind of withdrawal, and so Congress backs down so that they can give the president money. What Congress needs to do is continue to push and force the president, if you want more money, you need to give a little bit and allow for these benchmarks and this gradual withdrawal or whatever. That would be one way that we could conceivably and actually constitutionally end the war. The only problem is Congress keeps folding on that.
All right, so what I'm hearing from the panel is that Congress could pass a law or a resolution officially declaring an end to this war. If the president did not comply, they could take it to the Supreme Court. If he still did not comply, impeachment is the answer.
I do not think impeachment is the answer. Impeachment is for high crimes and misdemeanors.
But if they passed a law to end the war and he didn't obey it.
It is not for disagreeing with the policy of the president. But Congress does have the power of the purse. In most institutions and organizations, whoever controls the checkbook has control.
Where's the pants in the family? Where's the pants in the family?
Yes. Yeah. And so, never mind. Anyway, but my question is, you could restrict funding and not do it tomorrow or next week. You could set a timetable and say funding ends in 6 months, a year.
So you think the appropriate thing is to pull the funding on the troops after a certain time period?
That's the power Congress has. They have the power.
They don't have to do it immediately.
Congress appropriates the money, and they spend it.
Yes, absolutely.
But in a conceptual idea of government here. The current President Bush's his administration has already preempted the possibility of that through the unitary executive theory, right? That in the capacity as commander-in-chief, the president cannot be bound by any law of Congress, all right? And so, you know, this gets to the fundamental issue here: is as Americans, how do we interpret our Constitution, and how do we, as an American people, choose to use force?
Are you referring to the president's claim that his war powers supersede all other laws and constraints by Congress?
This is a classic expression of the unitary executive theory. Yeah.
At the risk of changing the topic, if I can,
This is fun.
in a little way, most of the examples that you folks used in terms of veto, executive privilege, democratizing war powers, it speaks to issues about the Constitution that are sort of outside of the framework itself, not specifically delineated in the document, implied powers. Those, do you think that the Constitution has become antiquated? It no longer means anything to the very people that are actually occupying positions of power in Washington, and probably less to the average American person? And if so, is there anything that can be done to change it?
The question is the Constitution antiquated to the people who are enforcing its laws?
I would like to hear the opinion of some of the students on that. I really would. That's a very good question.
Has it
Any
become
opinion on
obsolete?
that?
Do we need to rewrite the Constitution?
They defer back to you. So I'm going to throw it to you, Heather. The ball's in your court.
How about a show of hands? It's Constitution Day. How many students in the room have actually read the Constitution?
Oh,
don't do
that's
that.
not fair.
That's not fair.
All right. How many
That's
people
not
have
fair.
actually read the Constitution? Oh, that's putting you on the spot, isn't it?
How many people think the Constitution needs to be revised? In what ways?
All right. So, how would you like to revise the Constitution?
I don't know. I just think it's really old and
Antiquated.
like for
Gotta get
the way our
talking.
society is growing, it doesn't fit the needs of the society anymore.
It doesn't fit the needs of society. So just should be amended or scrapped altogether?
Just meant.
Any particular amendments?
I think that the Constitution needs to be changed in a lot of ways because from what they're saying, it sounds to me like the Constitution has a lot of loopholes that people are taking advantage of. Being especially the president, having those vetoes that he's signing, that should not happen. That should be stated in the Constitution to say, you know, the president can abide by A, B, C, and not leave out the rest of the alphabet, and then the president kind of dodges that route. So in that sense, I think that it should be written down, and I know that the people that, well, I don't know this, but I'm thinking that the people that were writing the Constitution did not foresee the president doing acts like this, where Congress or the president would take advantage of things that they did not foresee happening.
I don't know if it's fair to say that they didn't anticipate the president doing it, but I think they anticipated the Congress and the
Yes.
Supreme Court doing more.
I mean, most of the foci at the Constitutional Convention was on the Congress and how they would possibly abuse the power they were given. Most of the concern was trying to control the Congress. And so as a result, relatively little attention was given to the presidency. And as we've said today, or this afternoon, it's really the president's power that relatively have grown. In fact, I have a question on executive privilege for Heather. Is Vice President Cheney a part of the executive branch? Can he claim executive privilege? Or is he?
Absolutely.
But he claims he's not a part of the executive.
Well, the First Lady has also claimed executive privilege, and they had to answer the question of whether or not the First Lady was actually in part of the executive privilege or whether or not she had to answer questions as well. And while she may not have been part of the executive branch or cabinet, she was entitled to keep those secrets.
Are you referring to Laura Bush?
Yes.
I'm joking about when the Vice President Cheney claimed that he wasn't part of the executive branch, remember?
Well, the Supreme Court and the courts are the ones that determine what the Constitution actually means. So they're the interpreters of the document, and I know they're not in the habit of asking me, but if they'd ask me, I would say the signing statements mean absolutely nothing. Are you? How do you feel about the signing statements?
But if they're the interpreters, doesn't that give them a chance to interpret it the way they want it to be interpreted at the time, depending on the situation, to kind of suit themselves? Whereas, one statement in the Constitution could probably be interpreted 3 different ways on 3 different occasions, depending on what the outcome, depending on what they want the outcome to be.
Yes, they can interpret the Constitution as they wish, but if Congress doesn't like the way they're interpreted, they can also be impeached by Congress as well. So, I mean, yeah, they do determine it to their liking, but I suppose if it's so badly interpreted, the Congress can get rid of them through impeachment.
I do want to respond to one of the questions that Musa asked a second ago about a comment about the Constitution and how one way in which we can make it better is to close some of the loopholes. And just referring back a little bit to the frame of thought of our founding fathers, it was they knew that they could never foresee everything that would happen in the future. So part of why they wrote a very vague document is to make sure that the document would in some way withstand the test of time, because they could no way have imagined the things that we have today. So sometimes to look at the original intent of the founding fathers is, once again, you're looking at the intent of 55 white male landowners who made decisions for the population as a whole. And as society has changed, so too does the government that governs it. And government has to evolve with society. And part of the great thing about our Constitution is that it can be amended. And while it takes a lot to amend the Constitution, that was also intentional by the Founding Fathers, because they didn't want the Constitution to swing back and forth like a pendulum and be manipulated very easily. So closing some of the loopholes, well, that's what makes America great, are these loopholes. But sometimes they can pose problems, but you have to ask yourself the question of whether or not it poses more problems or whether or not it allows for more solutions throughout time.
So the guard against the loopholes is not Congress or the Supreme Court, but instead amending the Constitution.
It's one solution.
Shouldn't someone have ultimate authority? I mean, if we say that he has the war authority, and Congress is maybe motivated by an upcoming election or how they want to place their vote, shouldn't somebody then have the power to say, I don't think this is the right decision to pull out? Not that I agree with the war, but shouldn't he have that ultimate authority in case the other motivations are politically motivated?
But is it a bad thing?
Okay, I
Is
think
it
I'm going to need that repeated because I didn't hear.
Yeah, you think the president should have the ability to disagree and keep the troops overseas as necessary? More power for the president?
When does it become, you've got one person over here and you've got the Congress over here, some of their motivations might be for an upcoming election. So how do you really know what's best for the country? Shouldn't one person have the power? He's the commander-in-chief. Otherwise, should we call it the Congress-in-chief?
Okay. Just to clarify, it is the Congress that decides when we go to war, according to the Constitution. And if the Congress and the President disagree, the President, she's suggesting, should maybe have the ability to keep the war going.
You also expressed concern over political motivations guiding Congress, and I would suggest that that is as it should be, right? They are politicians. And if a majority of their electorate wishes them to vote in a certain way, and if they are swayed by that, then that is the system working as it ought to.
And that's exactly what the Founding Fathers had intended.
And what the question is really being discussed here is how much power should the president have? And I would suggest that the ultimate power does rest with public opinion. You know, a president who has public opinion behind him, there is nothing he cannot do. And if he loses the support of the people, regardless of what the Constitution says, he cannot carry it out. And that certainly was evident with Lyndon Johnson in the Vietnam War.
You don't
The only
think that
problem
Bush has
is
lost
that-
the support of the people?
Well, yeah, the only problem
He
is
seems
now
to get-
his presidential approval rating is quite low. And
It can't
yeah,
get much
he's-
lower. And yet
oh, it
he's
can go lower, but
not statistically. It can't.
I think it's in the 20s right now. 30, 20, between 20
I
and
think any
30.
lower would be unprecedented, wouldn't it?
36. Okay, so yes, it can. It's been
Truman
lower,
was lower.
but the president can. And part of the reason why the president can still do what he wants to do is he's not running for re-election, so he doesn't have that accountability to the people, which goes back to the elected branch of government, which is Congress, should be more accountable to the people, as Ramona was saying, is through the election process.
I think she was suggesting that the president would be a better arbitrator here because the Congress does have to worry about an election and he doesn't, and that the power should rest with someone who is less burdened by an election.
We're talking about a king, though, in that scenario, right? The person who isn't concerned with elections or the will of the people. This is a
Well,
monarch.
that's how I understood the preference.
There was a
Is-
question up there, too. He had his hand up back there.
Well, as a response to that question over there, it's basically what he addressed. If there's a reason we have checks and balances, and that's to keep everybody sort of in check, hence checks and balances. But if you have one person with more power, you know, it's basically a monarchy. You can't let one person whose opinion can sway judge how stuff should be done. And that's just the basic comment I want to make.
Hooray for the checks and balances.
When they
One
were
down here.
I just have a question about something one of you said earlier about how the framers weren't really concerned about the president. They were concerned with the limiting the power of the Congress. And I was wondering, I was always under the impression that the framers didn't want a monarchy. They didn't want a dictatorship. So why wouldn't they want to limit the powers of the president to the one person? And
It wasn't that they didn't want to limit the power of each branch of government, but because the Congress had the power to legislate, because Congress has the power over the purse, because Congress had the power to declare war, they were very much concerned that if power was abused, it would be abused by the branch that had the most power. They thought that the president would merely be executing the laws that the Congress had passed. And so, for this reason, they were much more concerned about, in some ways, controlling Congress, dividing up there were various reasons for the attraction of it, but dividing up the power of the legislature into two houses, and in various other ways, putting checks on the power of Congress. It wasn't that they were not concerned about controlling government, period. They were very much for a limited government. But at the same time, they were concerned that if power was abused, it would be abused by Congress.
If I could just jump in here, just to re-articulate, you asked the question whether or not, why didn't the Founding Fathers limit the powers of the president more if they anticipated that there might be some sort of takeover in power for a monarchy. Well, actually, the Founding Fathers did limit the powers of the president the best they could. I think we often lose sight of the fact that when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, they intended that the President, the Congress, the Court would only have the powers that were listed, would only have the powers in the Constitution that it said it had. If it didn't say that the Congress, the President, or the Court could do it, it was left to the states. Hence, the powers of the federal government are so few, they must be listed. The powers of the states are so many, it is dangerous to list them. The Founding Fathers intended that the powers of the president be limited. That's why they didn't give him much power. Granted, they didn't articulate it well, and whoever came into power first determined pretty much how we interpreted the Constitution, and eventually it became an interpretation, well, it doesn't say anywhere in here that I can't do this, so look at me go. That's how it became, but that is not what the Founding Fathers intended. That's why Article 1 of the Constitution is so much longer than Article 2. And Article 2 is even longer than Article 3. They intended that Congress be the more important branch, the President be limited because they didn't give him much power. The only problem is, as society evolved, the President continued to take more and more power. I mean, the President's... we used executive privilege to purchase Louisiana for $1 million. That's nowhere in the Constitution that the President can purchase land on behalf of the United States, but they did it. Does it say anywhere in there that they can? No. But that was a different interpretation from what the Founding Fathers had intended.
So you're opposed to the signing statements meaning anything? Because they're not in the Constitution.
Am I opposed to them?
Yes, the signing statement.
Well,
as far as their legal significance.
don't know that I'd say I'm opposed to them. I would say that they're not in the Constitution. So were they the original intent of the Founding Fathers? No.
No.
And what is your opinion?
Are they constitutional?
You're asking whether or not they're constitutional.
I think
Exactly.
It would depend on the person who is on the Supreme Court to determine whether or not they're looking at the original intent of the Founding Fathers, or
the Supreme Court has
Carol,
already
are
ruled.
they constitutional in your mind?
No.
Bob, are they constitutional in your mind?
They're outside the Constitution. They're new ground. The Constitution could be amended to make that a part of it, but as present, as the Constitution reads, they're not in there.
So you don't approve?
And the Supreme Court has.
Is that thing on?
The Supreme Court has already
It's not
ruled
about
that the
opinion,
line
it's
item
about
veto
fact.
is unconstitutional.
I'm sorry?
The Supreme Court has already ruled that the line item veto is unconstitutional. And in effect, we have to be careful here. There are different types of signing statements. There are political signing statements, there are rhetorical signing statements. What we're focusing now are what scholars call the constitutional signing statements, in which a president is issuing a statement saying, in his opinion, certain parts of this law I am signing, I don't know why you'd sign a law if you thought this, is defective, is unconstitutional. And I'm directing the executive agencies to apply this law as I interpret the Constitution. And frankly, the Supreme Court has ruled that, the line item veto is unconstitutional, so therefore, by inference, the constitutional signing statements are illegal.
What about the other signing statements?
No,
Do you think any of them are legally significant?
No one's debating those. They're simply statements where the president is expressing his political opinion or his view about why this is good or bad law. No one is questioning those, and those types of signing
So
statements.
he can make his opinion. It's
Sure.
just his opinion needs to remain
But
just that.
the constitutional signing statements are regarded quite differently.
His attempt to rewrite the law.
To
Not acceptable.
interpret the Constitution.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience?
15 more minutes.
Okay, this is kind of more of an opinion thing, but I'm just kind of curious. Like with the upcoming election and everything, what we've seen so far from what they've spoken about, and obviously you can't predict who's going to be the next president, but with the direction that it's heading, where do you see the war heading to, and like what do you see happening to, issues that we have to deal with like poverty and unemployment, with the potential next president? Where do you see the country heading in those directions?
You want to go first?
Sure. With regard to where future administrations might take the war, based on the premise that the war will be continuing as the new president takes office, we've seen this pattern before. Right? We've seen it in Vietnam, where one president bequeathed the war to the next incoming president. And it would go on like that because no one wanted to be the president to lose the war. Okay? And so rather than a specific end, what we see, based on evidence, based on historical evidence, is the likelihood of continuation. Okay? As an individual, my fear, right, I can't forecast the future, but my fear is that the war will continue until the point when we pull out, and then the chaos will ensue inside of Iraq. Okay? And now this is a dire decision. Do we pull out now and let the chaos ensue, or do we wait 10 years and for more Americans and Iraqi people and other people to die and then pull out and allow chaos to ensue? It is a grim future.
Anybody else?
Well, in response to your question, where do you see the country going? Obviously, it depends on who the next president is going to be. The president has a powerful ability to shape policy. I mean, at the moment, the leading Democratic nominee is Hillary Rodham Clinton. She's supposedly announcing today a massive health care program that is going to be patterned very much after the program that she and her husband tried to implement in the early 1990s. If she's elected president, I think there will be more movement in that direction. If a Republican is elected, such as John McCain or so, there's going to be much more of a continuation of our foreign policy as it currently is.
Well, I would actually agree with what Professor Hendershot said in terms of where the war is heading. It's never going to be a clean war. We're never going to get out of there cleanly. It's you know, whether you agree or disagree on whether we went there, we're there now, and we have to deal with it. And whether or not we pull out troops now, and as you said, chaos ensues, or in 10 years and chaos ensues, it's going to happen. The question remains, as Professor Grin said, it all depends on who becomes president next. And in terms of where our country is going in terms of poverty, taking care of poverty, she obviously referenced Hillary Rodham Clinton's health care plan. And once again, it would depend on the president that is elected. If it's a Democrat, we'll start focusing more on domestic issues. We'll start focusing more on, we'll probably raise taxes, especially if there's a health care plan out there that attempts to give health care to everyone in the United States or demand that everyone carry health care. We'll also probably have more social spending within the United States. If it's a Republican president, you're probably going to see a more gradual draw out of troops, although depending on some of the candidates, even on the Democratic side, that might be the case as well. It depends on the day, and it depends on really what the reports are from the war in Iraq and, you know, General Petraeus or so on and so forth. So it depends on who's elected next, and that's part of the beauty of this country, is that in this country, we can elect the direction that we want to go in. The problem is actually getting people to do that. So,
I don't think it matters as much who's elected. Unless a candidate is elected and runs on the argument for getting out, I think we're going to be in there at least another 4 years, if not longer. I think even if Hillary Clinton gets elected, we're there for another 4 years. I don't hear anything from her that suggests that she would pull out anytime soon. I think there's going to be an incredible reluctance on whoever gets elected to avoid taking the loss that seems almost inevitable at this point. And so we could be in for the long haul. And it may be incumbent upon the Iraqis to kick us out.
Personally, this is an opinion. I think Iraq is not ready for America to pull out of this war. I say that because, I mean, these people have been exposed to violence for a very long time. And for America to just expect them to stand on their own 2 feet and say, okay, we're now pulling out, and you guys need to build up a government that needs to, you know, put ABC in place, and you need to run by yourselves, it's going to be, I mean, that's a wishful thought. That will not happen for a long time. Just look at America itself. When the Constitution was written, how long did it take for there to be a steady government? For 2 years, it was unsuccessful. And we should expect to see the same thing with Iraq, where they will have governments that will come into power and fail. Because obviously, a lot of people will try to come into power and probably rule in their own favor or do something that, and there's just too much violence going on in Iraq, and obviously there's religion involved, and politics. It's just too much. It's so overwhelming for the people. It's going to take a long time that there will be wind off that violence, and then finally get to a point where they can say we can actually now build up a government. And America, thank you very much for what you've done, and now we can stand on our own 2 feet.
So more of a comment than a question. As far as that's concerned, though, why should the current government of Iraq ever stand up on their own 2 feet as long as we're there to provide the excuse for why they don't need to?
Well, to kind of go off of that, I think the fact that we caught them off guard, we went there and declared war on these people. They were not ready for this. And now they have to just, all of a sudden turn around and say, hey, our government needs to chop up. Now we need to do this. We need to go this direction. And we've kind of forced them to go that direction. Before, they had Saddam, who basically just, he had a whip. He called the shots. He was like the man with the pants. And now they don't have this guy doing that. And now the government has to stand on their own feet, and we expect them to just do that overnight. It's not going to happen.
So we need to be there.
We need to be there until it's like raising baby. Until they can stand on their own 2 feet, then we start to withdraw gradually.
Why stay if they're not, if they're not gonna, if they can't balance themselves with us there, if they rely on us, they're never gonna rely on themselves. How are they gonna be able to do it themselves if they're sitting there relying on our troops and all our help that's over there?
So we should get out.
Yeah. In a sense of
How would you do it? How best to do it?
I don't know, but if the outcome's going to be the same in now or in 10 years, what are we doing for ourselves, or even for them to help them become better?
But should it be Congress that pulls the plug? Should they force the president's hand by passing a law? Impeach him? So it's not enough. It's not enough just to decide on what we want to do, but we have to decide on how it should be done according to the Constitution. Panel or a question?
Well, I'd just like to respond. I think that that's an excellent point. That part of making wise decisions in terms of foreign policy is to recognize limitations. Right? The United States is a superpower, yes, but it is not all-powerful. And democracy, attempting to build up a democracy, is not something that an outside force can do. Democracy comes from within, and it's not easy, and it can take centuries, right? France had a very bloody and difficult experience creating democracy, and so did the United States, right? Not even begun to, complete until after the Civil War in the 20th century. Mexico, another republic, another democracy, where they have had difficulty bringing their principles to fruition, just like the United States has. Right? To attempt to do it in Iraq, right, as an outside power, might be an unwise idea to proceed with as your premise. Okay? And the time might be, now or later, that Americans, and I'm not saying they will have to, but they might have to recognize that it's not something that is within our power to achieve, and to decide that based on that, it's time to come home as an honorable people who did the best that they could.
Does anybody else want to comment before I get this question?
So in this day and age, do you think Congress should amend the Constitution to give less power to the president or the executive branch?
To give what kind?
Does the president have too much power? Would you change the Constitution to lessen his power?
Well, I've already, commented on that. I think that changing that, making that would be the extension of a 20th century pattern of democratizing the use of American force, right? Sort of building on the premise of the War Powers Act. Right, the Congress has the ability to bring soldiers home, right, if they don't wish to approve it after 60 days, right? So if they have the power to declare war, if they have the power to authorize the use of force, then should the Congress not also then have the power to decide when that force should come to an end?
Isn't that already there, or do you think it needs to be added to the Constitution?
No. I don't think it's been explicit, and I think we lack a precedent.
Okay. I think there's also the issue of asking the question of whether or not we should take power away from the president and reside it with 535 members of Congress. I mean, part of the reason why the Founding Fathers created the executive branch was to be able to have one united voice on behalf of the United States. And yes, that's been abused throughout history, but would it be better to have 535 voices determining whether or not we can go into Iraq when these days we can't get Congress to agree on barely anything? So what kind of response are we going to have if we are requiring consensus or even a majority of 535 members of Congress versus the president? So that would be my response. I understand the problems with having the president having that kind of power, but what would be the alternative at this point? Yeah.
No, I agree that it isn't that the president has too much power, it's that Congress is not using the power that the Constitution provides for Congress. So really, I would not want to restrict the power of the president. And as I mentioned earlier, public opinion is a powerful, very powerful check on the president.
I think I need to clarify something that you brought up earlier, because I differ with you, Carolyn, when you said that Congress did not authorize the war in Iraq. They didn't explicitly said we declare war in Iraq, but as far as I'm concerned, they did essentially the same thing. They authorized the use of military force against Iraq, and I would argue...
But you also have to consider the information that they did that on.
Yes. And the other thing is, what I was saying is that Congress did not declare war. And that was my issue.
They deferred their responsibility. They gave a blank check to President Bush to decide at his own choosing when and if to declare war in Iraq.
To look for weapons of
mass
destruction.
They deferred their constitutional responsibility to him, which I thought was incredibly foolish.
But still constitutionally able to do.
I'll grant you that, but
okay, there's a question over here.
Constitutional and smart is another thing.
I think we have time for about one more set of comments, and I wanted to ask the panel and Keith if he'd like to comment as well. How do you think history, since the focus today is on the president, how do you think history will judge the presidency of George W. Bush?
Bob's looks like he's ready to go on this one.
No.
I think that for a long time this will be contentious, and I think that there will be confusion and bafflement. Right, the 2004 election was baffling to many people, right, because of the war. Right, the case for war, for example, was based on the idea that there were weapons of mass destruction, and these turned out to not exist. And yet the president was reelected anyway. Okay, he was either incorrect, right, or deliberately misleading. And it's up for each of us to decide which is which. But either he deliberately misled Congress or he was incompetent. Okay, and yet still, right, it's an either-or situation. Right, still, he was reelected, and that's baffling. And that's a testament to, above all else, the power of popularity, the power of public opinion. And so, I don't know. I think that his administration will stand out as a testament to public opinion in its power, even greater than that of the Constitution.
I'm getting very tired of listening to all this discussion about how the president is suddenly very concerned about shaping his legacy. You heard those kinds of talks and comments last Thursday night after the president spoke to the nation. I mean, the legacy is going to be judged on how well he does his job, and that's partly in terms of how things are going to end. If we have a disaster in Iraq, if there's another recession, regardless of what he does or his position, history is not going to be very kind to him. But the opposite could also be true. Think of Harry Truman and how he went out as a very unpopular president. And history has been very kind to Harry Truman. So I don't think we can really judge on how history is going to regard him. In my opinion, unless things improve dramatically in Iraq, it won't judge him very kindly, but it remains to be seen.
I think what's interesting is, well, one thing, how long are we talking? 20 years, 30 years, 100 years, 150 years? Because
1,000.
Because one thing that Americans and U.S. history is notorious for is that the victors write history. Mm-hmm. And we will write the history in how we conducted this war, and of course we will always write the history in that it was a very altruistic war, and that we went about this in the best way, and we were just trying to promote harmony in the world. And by writing history the way we want it to, you know, historians and the people who write the books are going to determine how President Bush is remembered. I mean, he'll get his library and be able to determine how he wants to be seen and what he wants to be seen as. But throughout history, you know, we've always written the United States in the best light, and I don't think that that's going to change.
But how is Vietnam treated?
I'll go out on a limb and say
as a mistake.
This
Yes,
president
and we wrote the
probably,
history.
in his invasion of Iraq, will probably make him one of the worst presidents in the last 100 years, and definitely the worst two-term president we've ever had. This failed policy in Iraq seems to have eclipsed everything that he might have otherwise done. That might have been great. And I think I don't think that'll change in my lifetime.
Do you think any president after 9/11 and anything that any president could have done after 9/11 would ever be written in a positive light?
Yeah,
I mean,
He had support behind him. He could have done anything after 9/11. Really.
Yeah.
If he had gone into Iraq and focused our resources on dealing with the if he'd gone into Afghanistan is what I meant to say.
Afghanistan.
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Thank you.
I misspoke. You know, things could be so much different today. And
Well, we're out of time.
Yeah.
okay.
But I will say I do agree with Heather, though, that the winners do write history, and time will tell whether I'm a winner or a loser, and you can decide for yourselves. But thank you for coming. We've certainly enjoyed the discussion. Thanks for your attendance.